The Cold War has started to end in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the wall that has divided not only the city of Berlin, but the entire European continent between a free and a liberal Western bloc and the Soviet Communist bloc. The end of the Cold War has further continued with Germany's reunification, where the western part of Germany, which was part of NATO and the European Union, was reunited with the eastern part of Germany, which was part of the Soviet bloc. And eventually, the end of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union itself dissolved in December 1991, signified the end of not only the rivalry between the Western, the liberal bloc led by the United States, and the Eastern Communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. It also meant that many other countries, for example, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, now became their own countries instead of being part of the Soviet Union. The end of the Soviet bloc and of the Soviet Union meant that many countries that have been under communist rule, and primarily under rule from Moscow, because Moscow decided what all these countries were allowed to do, from Poland to Central Asia, gave those countries new liberties and freedom to decide what they want to do and to decide their own fate. That included countries in Europe, for example, like Poland, Czechoslovakia at the time, the Baltic states, who very quickly decided they want to become members of the European Union and of NATO. They want to move towards the Western Bloc. But it also included countries in the East, for example, in Central Asia, who since then have become their own independent nation states, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and try to navigate their own future between Russia, China, and their regional neighbors. Lastly, we also have those countries that have been kind of in between. That applies especially for Ukraine, but also for the country of Georgia in the South Caucasus. Those countries have been part of the Soviet Union itself, and their desire to move towards the West, to move towards the European Union and NATO, has been seen very skeptically by Russia, by Moscow, which has emerged as the most important country from the Soviet Union, because Russia sees those countries as part of its own neighborhood, where Russia and Moscow should decide those countries' fate and not the countries themselves. For many countries of the Soviet bloc, the end of the Soviet bloc and then eventually the end of the Soviet Union itself meant new freedoms, especially freedom of expression, which is something that under communist rule was not possible, as communist rule to different degrees has been authoritarian, autocratic, or even a full dictatorship in the times of the Cold War. So the freedom of expression suddenly, for example, the citizens of Poland could say what they want without fearing persecution, has been one of the most important political successes, which also included that those citizens in those countries could now freely decide their own leadership. They could hold elections without interference from Moscow. They could form new parties, and they could decide their own fate and elect their own leaders without needing the approval from Moscow and from the Communist Party, which was the case during the Cold War. The greatest economic challenge for those countries from the former communist bloc was that they had to redo their entire economy to fit into the capitalist system. The shock therapy that many of those countries went through meant that the years after the end of the communist bloc were usually years of chaos, of confusion, and also of economic poverty, because all the institutions, all the economic ways of doing things that have been established over decades in the Soviet bloc have fallen apart. We have also seen a lot of investments from the West, from the United States and from Europe in those countries, where there was criticism that those countries were sold out to Western investors instead of building up their own new economic basis. So for the United States and many European countries in the West, the end of the Cold War, the dissolution, the end of the Soviet Union, meant that from their perspective, they have won a victory, because they have proven that the Western model of having free and liberal democracies where you can elect your leaders, of having free economic markets where you can just produce without getting quotas from the capital, has been more successful than the communist model, where a lot of these things have been controlled by Moscow. The end of the Cold War brought a lot of new opportunities of trading with those countries from the East, of investing in those countries in the East, but it also brought challenges. For example, Germany suddenly had to integrate the east of Germany, which was in the Soviet bloc, into its own economic model. And since many of those companies, for example, in East Germany, were not economically competitive, Germany had to carry through that new part of Germany with a lot of economic support. The same also applied to many countries from the former Soviet bloc who needed at first economic support from the West to achieve that shift and that change from being in the communist economic model to a free trading Western economic model. And it also meant for the West that all the military and defense capabilities that they have built up, they had big armies, big tank armies to protect against the potential attack of the Soviet bloc, were suddenly useless. Why would you still need NATO? Why would you still need all these armies to protect against an enemy that basically has collapsed? So many of those countries have reduced their spending for defense, have reduced their armies, and have really focused on economic trade, something that became a problem when in 2022 Russia invaded Ukraine and suddenly became a military threat to Europe again. So the end of the Cold War has started a new period for the entire world of free trading globally, of a lot of hopes that the future world order, the way how countries in the world organize themselves, would not be anymore defined by rivalry, by competition as during Cold War times, but would be defined by cooperation and by free trade between those countries, which would lead to more prosperity for everyone globally. And part of that became true. There has been an increase of prosperity worldwide because of the end of military confrontation and competition after the end of the Cold War. So there were hopes that the end of the Cold War could lead to a better world with more political freedom and with more economic opportunities and prosperities for everyone. But those hopes were very soon disappointed by the re-emergence of conflicts, both in regions in Europe, for example, the Balkan Wars, but also the re-emergence of conflicts on the African continent or in Asia.